Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second webinar in the Invasive Species Center Asian Carp Canada series. My name is Christine Pinckney, and I'm the Asian Carp Project Coordinator here at the Invasive Species Center. The Invasive Species Center has partnered with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada to develop this Asian Carp project, and these webinar series are part of that coordination. The Invasive Species Center is a national non-governmental organization that builds partnerships, identifies priorities, and supports projects to protect Canada from the damaging effects of invasive species. The Invasive Species Center also connects knowledge, stakeholders, and technology to prevent and reduce the spread of invasive species that can harm Canada. Today, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Kevin Irons. Mr. Kevin Irons is a large river ecologist and fisheries specialist, and he's currently the Aquaculture and Aquatic Nuisance Species Project Manager, or Program Manager for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. Today, he's currently involved with the implementation of the Asian Carp Management Framework to prevent Asian carp from establishing populations in the Chicago Area Waterways and in Lake Michigan. He also sits on the Great Lakes and Mississippi River Basin panels on aquatic nuisance species, and he co-chairs the Monitoring and Response Work Group as part of the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee and the Council of Great Lakes Governors Aquatic Invasive Species Task Force. He has also authored or co-authored over 16 peer-reviewed publications, and he serves as an incident commander for rapid response situations which may arise involving aquatic invasive species. Today, Kevin is going to talk to us about the multi-jurisdictional approach to Asian carp in the Upper Illinois River and Chicago Area Waterway system. Kevin, please feel free to go ahead, and afterward we're going to have a question and answer period, and Kevin will try and answer as many questions as possible within the time allowed. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Christine, and first thank you for hosting along with the Invasive Species Center and your work, your cooperative work with us here in the U.S. Certainly I'm following big coattails. Becky Cudmore explained a lot of what Canada's up to, and we hope to follow up that basically with what we're doing here in the U.S., and I'll briefly talk a little bit about some of the biology in a little bit more detail. That helps guide our actions here in the U.S. And end up just kind of broadly telling you what we're up to, and at least at a 30,000-foot level, you may have questions at the end that we can drill down even further if you like. I'm glad to do that. Certainly, I'll advertise it now verbally, but my email is just my name, kevin.irons@illinois.gov, and I'm certainly available to talk offline afterwards for any of those important questions. Well, Christine talked about quite a bit of my work, and I'm not trying to brag, but we're very busy in the state of Illinois and really across the Great Lakes Basin on the work we're doing in the context of invasive species and Asian carp specifically. As she mentioned, I work closely with the ACRCC, but also I've been working closely with Michigan and the other Great Lakes states and provinces as part of a Council of Great Lakes Governors, and of course that includes the premiers, and it's an AIS task force, an Aquatic Invasive Species Task Force. One of the key things we've done over the last year and a half is put together a mutual aid agreement, a way that we can work together across the basin when a need exists, that we can act together, and we have the support of our governors and premiers. That's huge in this arena of aquatic invasive species, that we can bring our resources to help each other out. So that is really good work, and it's only because of the work from all the representatives across the basin that that's possible. But I also get to work on the Great Lakes panel and the Mississippi River Basin panel on aquatic nuisance species. Certainly in the Great Lakes we're worried about a new player, Asian carp, possibly getting to the Great Lakes. But of course on the Mississippi River we have not only Asian carp but all these other ones, but we're trying to manage or control or otherwise mitigate Asian carp in that basin. So very similar topics, a little different angle. I also get to work on a national level with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies to really talk about policy that we can be consistent across the nation here in the U.S. And that can drill down to the Midwest Governors Association as well, looking at the large basin, the Mississippi River Basin. Obviously, I think introduced critters are an increasing topic, and we're really happy that they're taking the spotlight and actually some funding that we can get some needed work done. As we transition over to really talking about carp, I do this with a lot of my public speaking venues. We're not necessarily talking about grandpa's carp. You know, if I say we have an Asian carp issue, someone gives me the story. Oh, Grandpa used to catch that back in the day, and it was a fish. We liked it or didn't like it. But nonetheless, the common carp obviously has been in our continent for over 100 years. Brought in the 1880s and in a Johnny Appleseed fashion, sprinkled across the U.S. And Canada because the European settlers like this fish. They're very familiar with it. And so it's been around a while and probably has a bad name. I often refer to carp as being a four-letter word. And Asian carp are much different in many ways, and we'll touch on those briefly. When we talk about Asian carp, we're talking about 4 species. These are the 3 most common ones. And I'll give you the perspective. The bighead carp is on the bottom. And it grows the largest, up to nearly 100 pounds. The silver carp are those jumping fish that we see in the videos. Unfortunately, I can't show you any of those today because we don't want the system to crash. But the silver carp don't grow quite as big, but their jumping ability, hitting people, boats, really has taken over YouTube. That's what people most recognize as Asian carps now, I think. And finally, the grass carp, used by management agencies, especially in the Midwest or southern U.S., obviously eats vegetation, has the larger scales, but also can grow quite large, 70 to 80 pounds, some of the larger individuals. There is a 4th I mentioned, black carp. They're a snail-eating carp. Look very similar to the grass carp and used in southern U.S. aquaculture today because they still stand as probably the best way to control snails in aquaculture. The other thing is, of course, chemicals. And when you have a fish that you hope to get into the human market for consumption, using chemicals is frowned upon. So the biological control is still being used in the southern U.S. Now, for the rest of the talk, I'll be talking primarily about bighead carp and silver carp. Bighead carp on the left of your screen and silver carp to the right are those Asian carps that people are really congealed upon as being something they want to stop from getting into the Great Lakes. You can see their distribution throughout the Mississippi River Basin. You can note in Lake Erie there have been about 3 to 5 individuals caught. These are all been large individuals, and probably because of a large live food market back in the mid to early 2000s. Around the Toronto area, actually, about $5 million a year economy on bringing live bighead carp for those Chinese and ethnic groups that like these fish. Large cities around the Great Lakes on the U.S. side also probably have these live fish in markets, and a few of those found their ways into Lake Erie. We don't think they swam directly there, but it is good to note that they're large and doing quite well in a lake like Lake Erie. We would expect them to do very well too. No silver carp have been found in the Great Lakes. Grass carp have been found, and we'll keep that for another discussion. So historically, they were brought over. Let me back up. Historically, they were brought over in the 1970s for use in aquaculture to control algae. Problems in generally catfish ponds. They quickly got out, even in the 70s, being found in streams of southern U.S. And here we are today where they really have gone up the Missouri, the Mississippi, and the Ohio rivers quite well. So if I look on the Illinois River, so that's that river that connects the Great Lakes to the broader Mississippi River Basin. We've seen since 2000 a pretty large incline and reproduction of bighead and silver carp. This is from a long-term monitoring program. It's called the Lagrange Reach, and it's the center point of the lower half of the Illinois River. Based out of Havana, the crews from here do standard monitoring, electrofishing, hoop netting, multiple gears annually, and they've done so since about 1990. So you can see in the early 90s or throughout the 90s, there's very few fish, onesies and twosies I call it, and in 2000 we actually saw reproduction. They had significant populations where they found each other, and it went from just 1 or 2 fish a year to about 1,000 in the case for bighead carp, and 100, and you see that exponential increase. If you look at silver carp, and I'll kind of walk you through, it just went from hundreds being caught in any given year to thousands, to tens of thousands, even 100,000 worth of silver carp being collected, and then that was in 2008. So to say they're quite abundant is an understatement. Our most recent assessments show about 60% of the total biomass of fish populations on this section of the river being Asian carps. If I tell you 100,000 fish, sometimes we don't know what that means, so the use of videos and photographs has been very helpful. This one is by Chris Young of our Illinois DNR, but we most recently took NBC out on the river. That's Kevin Tibbles on the front of a shock boat. But there's a lot of fish. Hopefully that comes through when you see these pictures. This is, thankfully, in the lower part of the Illinois River where they're most abundant, but in October we did not expect them to act like this. Certainly lots of fish. To put more numbers on it, we've done some mark and recapture studies, and this is for silver carp only. And again, looking at just that Lagrange Reach, it's 80-mile-long reach in the lower part of the Illinois River, and you can look at numbers or biomass. But we can see these are numbers that we published back in 2007. 3,000 to 6,000 fish per river mile, and you can multiply that out if you like to see the whole population for that 80-mile reach, about 500,000 fish. Or in biomass, we're talking about 13 metric tons per river mile. And these are silver carp that are really subadults for adults. We did not take into account any small individuals at the time, young of year or fish under, say, 10 inches. So these are fish that we could put a tag in and hopefully get a recapture later. So 13 metric tons. So that's also another way to say there's a lot of fish out there. So some of the biological impacts that we've seen in 2000 is that benchmark, that basically before Asian carp are reproducing, and then afterwards is condition of some of our native fish. We chose bigmouth buffalo and gizzard shad to look at, and this comes from a publication that came out in 2007. But before Asian carp, fish condition was much better. For bigmouth buffalo, we actually saw an overall 5% decline in the average condition, and not only did it decline, but it continued to decline over those years after Asian carp. And actually, we've seen just a slight increase in buffalo conditions since this time, but not up into the pre-carp condition. The similar pattern for gizzard shad. We did not see that precipitous decline, but about a 7% overall mean condition decrease from before Asian carp were established. So you can see where you have a much more efficient fish coming in, feeding on plankton, rotifers, algae, and taking those resources away from some native fish. And it's one of the first times that was documented in a wild system, an open system. So this is Asian carp food. Essentially, zooplankton is the food of preference for the bighead carp, and phytoplankton and the smaller stuff for silver carp. And if they went to the supermarket, they may be buying food and something like this. Essentially, just a green algae slurry. The way they feed is they filter it. They have very good gill rakers. I'll show you those in a second. But this is a silver carp feeding just below the surface, and they can actively pump water from that very productive part of the river and filter it through their gills, leaving the food in their mouth to be swallowed, and obviously moving the water through and over their gills. You can see from the water in the background, the Illinois River is a very productive system also. So it's actually it's a pretty good home for these guys. So the gill rakers, obviously the red part of this slide is the gills and allows them to respire. The gill rakers are that structure that for bighead carp looks like a barber's comb, very fine slit where the food is filtered. Silver carp goes one step further and it looks more like a sponge. So bighead carp can filter down to maybe 20 microns, where silver carp maybe 5 to 10 microns. In addition to the structure, it does have the slimy coating that also entraps food items, and then it sloughs off so they can swallow it. So very efficient at getting those smallest particles out of our river, and we've already seen that they've been able to affect some native species. And we already talked about numbers, but if you look at all the mouths of silver carp across the landscape here, you get to multiply out each of those fish taking food. We've got lots of these fish. Again, 60% of the biomass. They can affect the Illinois River biologically, ecologically. Certainly why we're all concerned about letting them into the next great ecosystem, the Great Lakes, is they've already been impacted by things like zebra mussels, quagga mussels, not only sea lamprey, but alewife, many things that eat plankton resources, and this would certainly take that underbelly away. So not only do Asian carp affect native fish, we've seen them affect themselves, and over time, and this is just from the Illinois River, but we've seen it in other rivers like the Missouri, the Mississippi, and the Ohio as well. We see a decrease in overall condition of the bighead and silver carp, the invading fish themselves, becoming very robust when they first come out. Obviously, their numbers are lower overall, and we see a decline to less than what one would be basically an average condition. We see some of these in rivers like the Missouri be quite low, maybe 0.8, and actually cause an extinction event on the Missouri River where bighead carp were rare or not even been able to be found. Unfortunately, in the Missouri River, because it is so long, upstream populations spawned the next year and repopulated. So we started the cycle over. We haven't come to any similar extinction type events in the Illinois River, perhaps because we're much more nutrient rich. Another unique thing on the Illinois River is that we've seen multiple spawns in any given year, and we've seen lots of years with no spawns at all. This is from 2007. Not only were we seeing results of young of year from early July being present, but in August we found eggs as well. So there was evidence of at least 3 successful spawning peaks in 2007. The following year, 2008, it was probably the most successful spawn, but it was one spawn and one spawn only, and that was in June. So they're very plastic and adaptable species. They can invade quite well, but we're very thankful we don't have consistent spawning every year, and that's important to understand when we're doing our modeling and some of our removal, that they may not spawn in any given year. It's very closely connected with the hydrograph, rain events, and how the water is moving down the rivers. So initially, back in the 90s and 2000s, in addition to the monitoring that was going on by people at the Illinois River Biological Station with that long-term monitoring, Asian carp did come on to the radar, and a barrier panel that was convened trying to put an electric barrier near Chicago, initially for round gobies in the Great Lakes. We wanted to keep them from coming into the Mississippi River. Of course, government moves quite slowly at times, and by the time actually things got in the water, carp was more of a threat actually, because the gobies had already been found 7 to 10 miles downstream in fairly good numbers. But in the 90s and early 2000s, we were talking about these things. The Illinois DNR, the Metropolitan Water and Reclamation District of Chicago, along with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Chicago, we were out monthly looking with trammel nets and electrofishing to see if fish are approaching that area of Brandon Road Pool or Lockport Pool where the electric barrier is, to make sure we're starting to get some information about what's going on up in there. We also use minnow fikes looking for small fish. Certainly worried about large numbers of little guys getting up in that area. This initial monitoring was just focused directly below the electric barrier, and it was just that pulse of carp that we wanted to look for. We were catching gobies and looking for other things, but we had not been catching any bighead or silver carp, which is good. Things began to escalate a little bit more in 2009. We had electric barriers in place. We'll talk a little bit more about what that fish fence looks like and the structure of that. But carp numbers downstream were increasing. We show a picture of carp jumping. The YouTube videos were being shared. And the OMG moment was, are they jumping into Lake Michigan, into this next great ecosystem? Another thing that was going on is that we had that initial barrier up and running, but it required to be shut down for maintenance. It had to be shut all the way down to get some needed work done. So what if fish were there? What was going to happen? So we had a lack of knowledge beside the initial, the monthly sampling. And finally, a new tool was coming in, detecting eDNA, environmental DNA, right below the electric barrier. And they were looking, and they found silver carp eDNA. So something had to happen in 2009 before shutting off what is our only barrier at the time. We'll hear more about eDNA in some upcoming talks, but very simply, it was taking basically half a gallon or 2 liters of water from the environment in the upper right-hand corner, taking it back to the lab and filtering it onto a piece of paper, a filter, and then running the DNA and detecting or not detecting fish. That's a very simple overview, but kind of CSI. We've all seen how DNA is used at a crime scene, and this was telling us that DNA may be around the electric barrier. So we're very nervous. The reason that we're extremely nervous about eDNA being there, and this is the area we're talking about, this is where the electric barrier is because of the connection with the Great Lakes. And that's why I thought I'd give you just a quick history lesson. Back in the 1900s, these basins were essentially separated. This Plains River came down and joined the Kankakee River to form the Illinois River at that point, some 35 miles or so from Lake Michigan. But we had a problem in that time that we had pollution rampant in Chicago. A lot of their effluents from sewer, basically open sewers, were put in places like the Chicago River and the Calumet River. This flow went out into Lake Michigan, like many cities at that time. However, their drinking water then came from Lake Michigan and went back into the cities. We had a great disease problem. The Corps of Engineers came through and made a tremendous engineering effort, basically reversed the Chicago River, allowing that pollution essentially to go downstream, also diverting some of the Lake Michigan water, because we know dilution is the solution to pollution, right? But it essentially connected these two great watersheds. Now, for a long time, that was not a problem because these waters were so polluted, and essentially 50 to 100 miles downstream, aquatic life was imperiled, and we didn't have back and forth movement of critters at all. However, with the Clean Water Acts that came around in the 60s and 70s in the U.S., these waters began to clean. Downriver fish populations have increased, and today the sport fishery and the native fish communities throughout the Illinois River are quite fantastic, but it allows this connection where fish can move back and forth. So there are about 70 miles worth of canals above the electric barrier, and this is one place that we do a lot of our work, and initially started in 2009. But when these barriers were going down, we were certainly concerned about any possible fish below moving up into the watershed. And it's a large canal. People don't think of these ditches or canals. Well, you might be able to fill them in or do something like that, and you may. But the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal is quite large when compared to other canals. And in the world. The Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Welland or the Erie Canal are much smaller than the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, and certainly a vibrant part of the Chicago economy, as well as continuing to be part of that pollution control that has not gone away, as well as things like flooding control. When you get water in Chicago, runs off because of all the concrete and goes downstream. So it's a very critical part of the infrastructure of Northeast Illinois. So in that area where they put the electric barriers, here you can see the first of the barriers is called a demonstration barrier. Was put in 2002. Essentially, this is just putting cables in the bottom of the river, putting enough electricity to stop fish, much like a cattle fence. And both independent and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers show it's very effective at keeping fish from moving across. And since they've upgraded a couple times to put additional barriers to the point where there's power in the water almost continuously with all three barriers working at once. So if there is an outage, and these are on different power supplies, so something would happen, the other two would remain in effect, as well as having on-site generators for moments that they're required. This demonstration barrier is scheduled to be replaced and put up in this general area. It'll be called Barrier 1. So the barriers are really important as part of our strategy in keeping potential fish from moving. And in 2009, because of all the stuff we just talked about, EDNA and the need for fixing it, we came in and applied rotenone for about 7 miles of this canal to make sure there was no fish. Because we did that, we actually did found one bighead carp. Remember, EDNA was suggesting silver carp in the area, but we found one bighead carp, a small fish, but it was below the electric barrier. A lot of effort went in to get that one fish, over 12,000 person hours. And that was actually in 2010, I apologize. But a lot of effort went in below there. In the following spring, 2010, we went above the electric barrier with additional amount of work. And because of EDNA and suspicion, we increased, or we did another rotenone event, 2.6 miles were treated. No bighead or silver carp were collected in that event. Now we also started using commercial fishers, and in the spring of 2010, the very first day, using contracted commercial fishers above the electric barrier, we caught one bighead carp. So those two account for the only fish ever caught directly below or above the electric barrier. That has not changed to this date. Since 2010, however, we've ramped up our efforts significantly. We're doing monitoring because of a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that allowed funding to come to protect the Great Lakes. That's outlined in an Asian carp control strategy framework, and then it boils down into a monitoring and response plan, which we have annually, and it has up to 21 different projects that basically is work above or directly below the electric barrier to make sure fish aren't even approaching the electric barrier. And then finally, annually, we come out with a summary of the plan's results. So in 2013, we come up with an interim summary report that tells us what happened the year before, what were the fact-finding episodes, how many fish did we see, where did we sample, where is the science going. And this is all available on asiancarp.us. You can get on there and see what we're up to. Again, we have 21 different projects, 75 project objectives, and that's all in our monitoring response plan. Within that plan, there are 6 monitoring projects, and that's both using fixed and random sites above and below the barrier. We do fixed site sampling and random site sampling. We're looking for small fish. We're looking for juvenile fish, and the gears that collect those in different locations. And we're trying to look at distribution and movement of both juvenile and young of year Asian carps in the Illinois waterways to predict risk at the electric barrier. We also have 5 removal projects that are looking. It also includes response actions in the CAWS when we suspect something to happen. We've been out there dozens of times. We saw a fish or we have suspicion of a fish either because of EDNA or a report, and all the agencies respond and work together to see if there's any science behind that report. We do planned seasonal surveillance above the electric barrier, which is included in that removal project. We also have 4 barrier effectiveness projects, looking at the barriers and are they doing the job that we think they are. And we have 4 gear effectiveness evaluations. We're looking for fish, removing fish. Are we doing it with the right gears? And we also have 2 alternative pathway surveillance using law enforcement, looking in places like urban ponds where fish may come up in stocking events or have come up historically in stocking events. We're looking for those too. We can shut the front door, but we definitely don't want them going around the back door either. So it's a very robust plan. The overall goals, I have them out here, but just basically 5 objectives. 1, determine the distribution of carp in the Chicago Area Waterway system, and then use that to help inform our plan and any response or removal actions. And also removal of any Asian carp found in the CAWS to the maximum extent practicable. If there's one fish out there, we're trying to find that thing and make sure it doesn't have a chance to spread. We also want to find any vulnerabilities in our current systems and barriers, and also determine the leading edge of the Asian carp population. Are they at the barrier? Are they somewhere else? And what's the strategy to keep them at bay? And we also want to improve our understanding of factors behind the likelihood that Asian carp could become established in the Great Lakes. So if we look at all the information that we've collected, I can give you kind of a quick update. Thankfully, we do not see them in the Chicago Area Waterway system. Only that one individual was caught up here, and actually we think it may have been an escapee from one of these ponds that were stocked. It probably got out into the system and ended up in this lake where we found it. I did not have the history of something that was in the Illinois River that migrated up and through. We can do that through some microchemistry. Glad to answer questions about that later. Here's where the electric barriers are. And if you go downstream, again, where the Kankakee River and the Des Plaines River come together to form the Illinois, that's the place where we will start getting a handful of fish. With all the effort that we do, again, it's a combined effort with Fish and Wildlife Service, the Illinois DNR, our contracted commercial fishers, and other staff that are out on the water. USGS is part of our technology team. This is below Brandon Road Lock and Dam, and actually we just get a few fish down at the lower part of that reach. Now if we go down below Dresden Island Lock and Dam here, we get a more moderate population. We have fish here that we can catch on a routine basis. We don't see any reproduction up here. There's no successful reproduction. Although we've seen a spawning run, so to speak, we've never seen any eggs or young of year fish, even though we're looking for them. So you have to go all the way down to Henry, Illinois, and we're actually about 143 miles from Lake Michigan at that point. But that's where we start picking up some young of year fish. So our sustainable spawning population is well downstream in the Illinois River. Also, we are watching that black carp, and we've had a couple of those occurrences in the southern part of the Illinois River. So that kind of gives you an overview of where the fish are. We have an adult population here, and that's why we think a strategy of contracted removal with fishermen is possible. And to date, we've taken 2.6 million pounds of fish from this upper Illinois River, and that's part of the strategy of keeping them from advancing any farther up, challenging the electric barrier. All of our sampling results, whether you're talking about the Chicago Area Waterway system, our contracted removal, or some population assessments downstream, are put up monthly on AsianCarp.us. You can follow this link. You can go to asiancarp.us and look for monthly updates. And it's under current action, and just select the month that you want to see the updates. And all the agencies that are working together on this, including Ontario and DFO Canada, will post things, and we'll have them up there on a monthly basis. So you can see what we've been doing, what we've been finding. So basically, we've got a three-tier or a three varying approach. We're looking in Chicago for any rare fish, or to say things have changed since 2010. This is our 4th year. We started out, this was the focus. We spent all of our time up here doing less work downstream. In 2014, because of all of that, tens of thousands of hours, we go up here both spring and fall and repeat all those collections. Over 300 electric fishing runs, over 300 net sets to confirm that nothing has changed. And we're looking for those rare fish above the electric barrier. We're doing much more work now below because we're taking the fight to the fish. We want to find out more about that leading edge and where that is. This is the Upper Illinois River. We're looking for contracted removal and detecting that population for us. Southern Illinois University is doing work downstream to basically tell us the population overall. And this is a place where commercial fishermen can actually fish at large and for profits and catch Asian carp as well as some commercial native species. So in the CAWS sampling, we do have fixed sites from the shores of Lake Michigan down into the canal, and from Lake Calumet below O'Brien Lock. We go to those both in the spring and summer now. We were doing that monthly in the early years of our monitoring, 2010, 2011, and 2012. We also do random sites that fill in the gaps here, so we're catching the 70 miles worth of canal quite well with electrofishing and netting efforts. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is also doing EDNA analysis and telling us what that means on a basis, whether it's changing over time. So this talks about our seasonal intensive monitoring in the Chicago Area Waterways. We've gone out there in June and September, and we had EDNA monitoring going out the weeks prior to that. And this is a cooperative event. Illinois IDNR, Fish and Wildlife Service, Corps of Engineers, and our contracted fishers are going out. I should mention our contracted fishermen are really people who have fished all their lives, but they have a biologist on board too. Not only are they good at catching these fish, but we have a biologist on board to capture the information on how they're catching it and what gear they're using. During these events in 2014, over 400 travel and gill nets were set. That's about 50 miles worth of net, and 350 electric fishing runs at both the fixed and random sites were done. We also pulled two 800-yard seine hauls, and that was in Lake Calumet, the location where that bighead carp was found back in 2010. It is very nutrient-rich, green water. It is carpy-looking water, so we do a little extra work in there. In all, we've caught 22,000 fish, over 50 species, one hybrid. No bighead or silver carp have been detected. Now, as we go downstream, the role of our commercial fishers is more important. We call this barrier defense. We're defending the barrier, sometimes with removal of fish, and this is a typical commercial boat with one biologist and two commercial fishermen. Unfortunately, you see our problem with Phragmites and purple loosestrife here behind the fishermen. Once they catch these fish, the bighead and silver carp come back and are thrown in the back of a truck and removed from the waterway. In fact, the company that's providing the removal right now is making a liquid fish fertilizer. So in all, we've been fishing with our commercial guys. Over 1,000 miles of nets have been deployed in that part of the Upper Illinois Waterway. 2.6 million pounds of fish have been removed. The good news is, between our sampling and that prior to the ACRCC getting involved, we have not seen that leading edge move since 2006. So for about 8 years, things have not changed. We're very thankful, and we're trying to figure that out. In fact, USGS University of Illinois and Illinois IDNR, we're discussing why is that happening. Why aren't they going up farther? And maybe there's something inherent in the watershed itself. To summarize our removal of just here in 2014, we've taken out an additional 50,000 fish. And that's about 250 tons. We are using other gears too. Instead of the typical gill nets and trammel nets, here's a seine. This is one of those 800-yard seines, nearly half a mile long, and they spread it all the way across the lake and pull the fish in. Some of those catches can range to over 50,000 fish in one haul, and it can be a good way to do that. We try to do this in the wintertime. Obviously, in Illinois, we're somewhat warmer, but not all winters are conducive. So when there's ice in the water, it's very tough. This is a proud biologist, Blake Rubush. We caught 50,000 pounds in this haul. So is it working? We've removed 2.6 million pounds, and these are our commercial catches over a couple years, just to show that we do see a trend of decreasing fish, although we also see things like catching being better in the spring and the fall. So we're actually changing our strategy and doing more fishing in the spring and fall. Also something to know is that although these numbers are lower, we're actually doing more, and I think more efficient work, because we're communicating with the hydroacoustic teams are out there. They'll tell us where there's a lot of fish, and our commercial guys will chase after them. So we're becoming more efficient. So we should see this number increase, but it's still decreasing. So that's telling us there may be some success. Certainly I understand that there's challenges to assessing these large populations in the wild with commercial gear alone. For people concerned about the native fish, 78% of the things we catch in those commercial gears are Asian carp. Other commercial species, large-bodied suckers, common carp, are about 19% of that catch. 2% are some game fish, but these gill nets and nets aren't dead set. They're only set for half an hour to 45 minutes at a time. All those other species are removed and then put back into the water. So I think the impact is very small, and most of these fish do quite well after being released. So the other things what we're trying to do, we're bringing Southern Illinois University on board to look at the population from a scientific point of view, not just commercial catches, looking at things like emigration, natural mortality, harvest mortality, and we can do very well. In some years, we've seen the harvest mortality be up to about 80%. And some years they're smaller, and we see increased immigration. So we're trying to come together on what the population is doing, and how we can affect that population. The way they do that with the hydroacoustics is running up and down the river. In 2011, it was about 3,400 kilometers sampled of these transects, and we actually went into the backwaters in 2012. I'm trying to do that at low water so we can see all the fish and see what the population looks like. Now we're doing mark and recapture. Here's a commercial fisherman with one of our recaptured fish, and they get quite competitive in how many of those little bands they can get. But all those are individually numbered, and also adds to our model of population of fish in the upper river as well as the lower river. We do have a model. Michigan State University was a partner with Southern Illinois University to come up with a model of fish, and they say it's going to be really hard to fish them to extinction. However, I think there's a lot of good news here that we can significantly change the population, perhaps up to 50% by commercial fishing. And this was a basic model, lots of assumptions, so we're trying to fine-tune it with another simple model. Model people think this is simple, but there's lots of interactions that we just took out of the literature for that first approach, and we're trying to understand, and this is going to be a spatially explicit movement model. Where in the river the fish are, we want to understand the population there, and then their desire to move upstream, ultimately to have a risk analysis at the electric barrier. We know where the populations of fish are, what's the risk at the electric barrier, and what are those things we can do through harvest and targeted harvest to to reduce that risk even further. One thing we did, we wanted to make sure that removal of fish was a right tack. Southern Illinois University worked with commercial fishermen. They removed 3 million pounds of fish from the lower Illinois River as part of a meal order, fish meal order. And for just taking 3 million pounds, now this is a place on the river that we already take 7 million pounds out annually by commercial means. By increasing that by 3 million pounds, we've seen change in the population size structure, the relative abundance of fish in that area, and the sex ratios have changed. So it gives us some hopeful advances that we can fish and change the population farther downstream for the benefit of the ecosystem. So ultimately, a lot of the things we're finding, the catch rates are decreasing. Silver carp numbers are smaller, and the leading edge hasn't changed. Some of the results that we can influence, larger populations, very promising, and we haven't found any fish above the electric barrier since that first one, and only one, caught in 2010. And no bighead or silver carp in Lake Michigan. These other things I'm going to go through a little bit quicker, but we're looking at unconventional gears, bringing large Great Lakes-style trap nets into our river system. Can that increase our odds of catching fish? Certainly, we can leave these trap nets in place for long periods of time, over 100 days, and just go back and catch fish. So if we're looking for rare fish, this may be a good tool, as it's proved quite effective at catching bigheads and silver carp. Next slide. I've got an error that the go-to meeting is not responding.
Okay. Do you want to try that again?
It won't move. Can someone else move the slide?
I will move it for you.
All right, thank you. So the water gun development, this is a cannon or a boomer, or it's basically making a loud sound pressure in the water. It both can kill small fish, and I think it's going to be highly effective at moving fish in a watershed. So we're using water gun development with USGS. Next slide. Looking at urban ponds across the Chicago area, those closest to Lake Michigan, we've taken fish out, as bighead and silver carp, out of these watersheds. Next slide. Some of those quite large, 72-pound bighead carp. It was in that pond for a long time. They basically come up here probably with channel cat stockings maybe 15 years ago. The next slide. Those other pathways, we're beginning to look with our law enforcement to make sure they're not in our live food markets. And we're working very closely with our conservation police officers. Next slide. And we're looking at places with CPOs and biologists to make sure they're not in our live bait either. We have not found any in live bait. Next slide. I hope it's coming across that we're integrating our pest management issues quite well. It's kind of a funny thing, whether it's integrated pest management or integrated pest management. But nonetheless, we're bringing expertises from across the disciplines together to fight these nuisance species in a new and unique way to make us more efficient. Yes, next slide. We're using things like carbon dioxide. We know we can move fish quite well with carbon dioxide. We're investigating the use of carbon dioxide as a barrier, perhaps in a lock chamber or below a lock chamber. Next. We understand commercial efforts are a great way from looking at China. They're really good and delicious food and low in contaminants when compared to other things, more like farmed catfish than tuna or Ruffe. And this is just mercury. Next slide. And nature tells us they taste good. Okay, next slide. And I want to go through this very quickly. Eurasian rust, is something else that, and I wanted to, we're changing from Asian carp, but I want to demonstrate the basin is working together. Another species coming down the Great Lakes. Next slide. We use eDNA again to say, are they moving? And initially, no. Next slide. However, upon closer examination, we actually found it in Illinois and Indiana waters, and basically created a response. Next slide. We brought people from across the Great Lakes, including Indiana and Illinois. We brought people from Michigan and other states through an incident command structure, and we sampled for Eurasian Ruffe because of those couple eDNA positives. Thankfully, no Ruffe were found, and we're maintaining vigilance and looking for fish in that area. Next slide. Essentially here we caught a lot of fish, no Ruffe, but we found things like gobies and other bad players. So we'll continue to work with our partners on that. But this was the first use of a mutual aid agreement and to work on our Great Lakes, so we're very proud of that effort. Next slide. Ultimately, we're trying to keep the Great Lakes from looking like this in regards to grass carp and some pretty cool photo shopping. Next. And it's not possible unless we have the use and the friendship of all of our partners. So Ontario and Canada is part of that. Our federal partners and our researchers here in Illinois have made all this work possible. So we're very thankful for their help. Next slide. And my last slide would be just to remind people to be a hero, transport zero. So we reach out to our recreational water users and tell them they can help us by not moving things around the landscape. And we're trying to do more new and unique ways to reach them with the same message. Because we may be able to stop them in aquatic ways, but we don't want them to go around the back door. I think you have one more slide, Christine.
I do.
My contact information. I'm always willing to answer questions. I know I ran a little bit long on some of the details, but either by telephone or by email, I can answer any subsequent questions.
Well, I think we have a couple minutes left if you wanted to answer one or two questions. I know there has been a few typed into the question box. So I'm going to read a couple for you if you wouldn't mind answering. That'd be great.
Yep, thank you.
One question was that even though there's been programs in place since 2006 for monitoring the ballast water to prevent invasive species, what's the probability of Asian carp eggs or young coming into the Great Lakes via the ballast water discharge in the future?
Sure. I think it's very low. You know, the probability can't ever really approach a zero. But one of our partners, the U.S. Coast Guard, actually did a study to look at can eggs and larvae from places where they reproduce, the lower Illinois or Mississippi River, get into the holding places in barges. Not quite ballast, and they don't have the pumping system that Lakers or ocean-going vessels have. The short answer is yes, they can get in there and actually survive. Certainly larval fish have been found in there doing quite nicely. However, these ballast areas you have to put a pump down in there and actually physically put the pump in and pump the water out. One, there's regulations that says moving ballast across the electric barrier is not permitted. But two, in that pumping process, it kills virtually all of these larval fish that comes out. So yes, it's possible. We think the impact and risk is very low.
Okay, great. Also, for any imports of live fish, can the Michigan and Illinois governments make it a requirement that all fish must be tagged? And would that help to identify where any live fish caught came from, that were caught where they came from?
Possibly. No, you cannot move any, in Michigan and Illinois specifically, you cannot move any live bighead or silver carp legally. Obviously, we're looking at that very closely. We know fish have been found at the Canadian-U.S. border, and we're working on ways to regulate that. I know Ontario is also very interested in that thing. But no, I mean, legal movement of live fish is not happening, so we have to work on the ones that aren't so above board.
Okay. And I would like to remind anyone who's still on the webinar that if you do have a question, we have a couple minutes left if you wanted to type it into the question box, and I will read them as they come up. Okay, another question for you, Kevin. Does Canada have a real voice in the decision-making process on what will be done to mitigate the threat of in the Chicago waterway, what that poses? Since Canada will have to live with the potentially catastrophic result of any inaction or inadequate action, shouldn't it have a legitimate say in what takes place?
Absolutely, and the short answer is specifically for our work as it's funded through the GLRI and the ACRCC, they're now, both Ontario and DFO Canada are part of that process. They have reviewed our plans and workshops, I think, favorably. I know we've had DFO Canada to Illinois and shown them what we're up to, and even cross-train some of their staff. If you want to come, if you want to know how to catch Asian carp, come to Illinois, and we'll share our expertise, and hopefully you'll never catch one in the Great Lakes. So informally, I talk very well across the basin. That's part of what I do. And we take all comments very, very seriously. To even further that is that we're starting a relationship with China, a place that has these fish for thousands of years, to further identify ways, catching or otherwise removing fish beyond what we've already recognized.
Okay. Another question. You talked about a hybrid fish that was caught during your monitoring study during the webinar, and what was that hybrid fish?
Oh, it may have been a bluegill green sunfish hybrid. I can't tell you that exactly right now. Unfortunately, we catch other invasive fish or non-native fish, things like tilapia, silver arowana. Some of these things are either in aquaculture or, frankly, an aquarium industry. We found those in the CAWS too. Most of them don't stand a chance of surviving an Illinois winter. But it's starting to guide our policy. We're making sure we treat things like tilapia as restricted species, and for those people trying to raise them, make sure they're not being dumped in the canal and track that better.
Question about the electric barrier. Is it 100% effective 24/7? What happens if there's a power outage or flooding? Or are there alternative solutions?
Well, yeah, we're concerned about that. The nice thing is that we have multiple barriers on at once, and we wouldn't expect them all to go off at once. Is anything 100% effective? Probably not. We definitely know small fish are less prone to electricity than larger fish, and so that's why we do so much monitoring. Thankfully, we don't feel that there's a high risk of bighead or silver carp directly below the barrier, and we're there throughout the summer every couple of weeks, and we look at that area very intensely. But the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is leading that project, and I know they've got people working with the Fish and Wildlife Service about effectiveness. And can a fish get pushed through by barges? Those are things that are on our radar, and can we manipulate the electricity to make improvements? I think yes. And how do we do that? They're working on it. So, but I think it's very, very effective. I don't know if I can put a number on it, if it's 90% or 95 or 98. Fish aren't streaming through that area, and we've got thousands or millions of tagged fish identification, and none of them have gone through from downstream to upstream. We're very thankful for that.
Okay, good to know. Okay, I think we're out of time now, so I'd just like to say on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you, Kevin, for this exciting and informative presentation about Asian carps and what's going on down in your area in Chicago, Illinois. I'd encourage anyone to please visit our website at www.asiancarp.ca to look for any more information, and also Kevin has the website that he put up. It's asiancarp.us to see more specifically what's happening in the U.S. Please come back for more webinars. We have one on November 25th about Canada's Asian Carp Early Detection Monitoring Program, and another was going to be on December 3rd. And it's going to be on Canadian research in support of the Asian carp management programs. Just a reminder as well, this webinar has been recorded and it will be up on the Asian Carp Canada website. Sometime next week it should be available under the Resources tab. So I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Everyone have a great day. Hope to see you at the next one.